The citadel of quiet. Night draped the city like a widow's veil, and only one lamp burned in the upper gallery of the old observatory that locals still called the Citadel of Quiet. From its iron balcony, you could see the river sliding black beneath the bridges, the barges sliding black beneath the stars, and farthest off, the palace where the regent held court in a perpetual murmur of flattery and fear. Inside the gallery, a single man stood motionless, his gloved hands resting on the stone balustrade as though he were testing its temperature. He wore no badge of office, no jeweled chain, no colors that would name him friend or foe to any faction in the city. His cloak was the gray of river fog, his boots the dust brown of autumn roads. Only his eyes carried a sharpened edge, and that edge was turned inward, as if he were cutting himself free of every word he had ever spoken. His name was Niccolò Machiavelli, though few now living remembered the syllables in the right order, and the stories told of him had long ago ceased to be stories and become weather, something everyone felt but no one planned for. Tonight, 9 visitors would climb the spiral stair to this room. They would arrive one by one, breathless from the steep ascent and from the weight of their own secrets. Each believed he or she had come to learn something. None suspected they were about to be unmade by silence. Niccolò had not advertised the gathering. Invitations were folded into the blank spaces of other conversations, slipped between the lines of letters, hinted at by the absence of reply. The art of withdrawal, he had discovered, begins long before the tongue is stilled. It begins in the refusal to extend oneself where one is not yet master. And so he had waited, letting the city's noise exhaust itself, letting every voice that might have competed with his grow shrill and careless. Now the hour was ripe for a different kind of harvest. He turned from the balcony and crossed the chamber to the round oak table that dominated it like a moon fallen to earth. 9 chairs waited, none of them alike. One was a child's throne-like thing of carved walnut, another a crippled stool bandaged with wire, a third a velvet fauteuil, whose springs had broken so that it embraced whoever sat in it, like a lover who could not let go. Niccolò had chosen them deliberately. Each seat would remind its occupant of some earlier humiliation, some place of powerlessness that speech had once failed to remedy. On the table itself lay an hourglass of smoky glass, its sand the color of dried blood. The upper bulb was nearly empty. When the last grain fell, the lesson would begin. He did not touch it. Time, he believed, was more persuasive when left to its own devices. Below, in the crooked lanes that smelled of tar and bruised rosemary, the first guest was already climbing. She moved like a woman who had once danced in great halls and now danced only in memory, every step deliberate, every breath counted. They called her the Marchioness of Hollow Vale, though her estates had been lost to the regent's taxes, and her title now clung to her like a borrowed shawl. She carried, wrapped in black silk, the broken coronet she had worn on the night her husband was executed. She intended to lay it before Niccolò as proof of her grievance. What she did not know was that the real proof would be the tremor in her fingers when she unwrapped it, the reflexive half-sentence that would escape her lips before she caught it back. Niccolò would listen to that aborted syllable and learn more than any chronicle could tell him. Behind her, at the distance of a shadow, came the second guest, a young artillery officer whose uniform was still bright, but whose eyes had begun to curdle with the first suspicion that courage and promotion were not always bedfellows. He had once been famed for the clarity with which he could explain the trajectory of a cannonball. Now he dreaded every question that began with "What do you think?" because he no longer trusted the compass of his own convictions. Niccolò had watched him from a cafe balcony the day the officer tried to toast a victory that had never materialized. The speech had faltered, the glass had trembled, and the silence that followed had been thick enough to choke on. Tonight the officer would discover what that silence had been saving him for. One by one the rest ascended. The banker, whose ledgers were immaculate, but whose daughter had vanished into the regent's household. the actress whose voice could sell any grief except her own, the physician who had learned to diagnose every ailment except the sickness of hope, the widow of a mapmaker who carried rolled charts. She could no longer bring herself to unroll. The boy poet who had been paid in copper for verses that others wore engraved on their hearts. The foreign diplomat with gloves so white they looked like bandages over wounds he would not discuss. And finally, the blind lutenist who navigated the stair by tapping his cane in a rhythm that echoed the long-lost music of the court. Each believed they climbed toward counsel. None understood that the first step toward power is the recognition of how little one needs to say in order to be understood. When the 9th footstep died against the threshold, Niccolò lifted the hourglass, inverted it, and set it down. The sand began its slow descent. He did not bid them sit. Instead, he himself remained standing, arms folded, face unreadable. The silence that settled was so complete they could hear the candle flames guttering in their sconces. One by one the guests lowered themselves into the chairs chance had assigned them, and each felt the furniture's secret malice. The child seat made the Marchioness feel grotesquely large. The broken stool skewed the officer's spine into a posture of perpetual apology. The velvet chair swallowed the actress so deeply she seemed to be vanishing before their eyes. Niccolò let them feel the discomfort for the length of 3 heartbeats, his own heartbeats, slow and deliberate, then spoke for the first and only time that night. 9 moments, he said, and the words were quiet enough to be mistaken for the wind when the tongue becomes a traitor. Tonight you will watch yourselves betray yourselves, and in the watching you may learn what it is to withdraw. He lifted a finger, not in command but in warning, and the candles dimmed as if the gesture had gutted them. Then he fell silent again, and the lesson began. IV. The first veil. Fools who perform. The Marchioness was the first to break. Years of rehearsed dignity had taught her that silence, like jewelry, must be worn sparingly and never left overnight. She unwrapped the coronet with the flourish of a tragedian unveiling a corpse, and the diamonds, those that had not been prized out by the regent's tax collectors, caught the candlelight and scattered it like cheap glass. This, she began, is what remains of honor. But Niccolò's gaze was not on the circlet, it was on the tremor in her wrist, the way her thumb compulsively stroked the empty socket where the largest stone had been. He did not speak, did not nod, did not even blink. He simply let her sentence dangle until its own weight tore it in half. In the hush that followed, the Marchioness felt a blush rise that had nothing to do with the room's warmth. She had expected indignation, sympathy, at least recognition. Instead, she received a silence so pure it felt like an accusation. Around the table the others shifted, the diplomat's gloved fingers tightened, the boy poet bit his lip hard enough to taste iron. The Marchioness tried again. Surely you see. Again the silence engulfed her. She heard, as if for the first time, the theatricality in her own voice, the brittle clang of rehearsed outrage. The diamonds seemed suddenly gaudy, the story threadbare. Without meaning to, she let the coronet fall. It rang against the oak like a cracked bell. In that instant she understood. She had been speaking not to be believed but to be watched. The performance had mattered more than the grievance. Niccolò's silence had stripped her of the audience she needed in order to exist. She sank back into the child seat, diminished, and for the first time in years she closed her mouth, not out of prudence but from a species of awe. Across from her, the artillery officer felt the lesson sink in like a shell that does not explode on impact but burrows deep before detonating. He had spent months arguing with superiors who mistook bluster for strategy, who demanded explanations louder than the guns themselves. He had shouted himself hoarse, proving that he was right, and each shouted syllable had only made him easier to ignore. Now he watched the Marchioness's humiliation and saw, as in a mirror, his own. The way he had danced attendance on fools, flourishing diagrams like bouquets, begging for applause that never came. His hands, which had been clenched in his lap, slowly opened. In the hollows of his palms he felt the ghost weight of cannonballs he would never again describe before they were fired. The second veil. The tempest within. The silence deepened, became almost viscous. The candles burned lower, elongating the shadows, until the room seemed to be sinking into its own reflection. It was the actress who next felt the ground shift beneath her. She had spent the evening studying Niccolò's face for cues. She had built a lifetime on reading faces, but that face gave back nothing. Instead, she found herself listening to the storm inside her own ribs, the furies of a woman who had played queens and courtesans, but had never managed to play herself. Every role required a voice pitched to the back row. Every curtain call demanded a smile bright enough to bleach private sorrow. Now, in the absence of script, she felt the full acid sting of all the words she had swallowed in order to remain employable. Anger rose, then shame, then a grief so sudden it tasted like seawater. She closed her eyes and felt the velvet chair embrace her as though she were already part of its upholstery. And there, in the hush, she discovered a stillness she had never permitted herself on stage. The storm did not cease, but it ceased to command her tongue. It became whether she could observe rather than whether she had to become. Niccolò watched the change with the patience of a man who has learned that every tempest carries its own eye. He had once been a soldier himself, long ago, and he remembered the night his own fury had betrayed him. He had stood before a tribunal, accused of a failure that was not his, and he had defended himself with every weapon language affords: sarcasm, logic, righteous indignation. The more eloquent he became, the more certain the judges grew of his guilt. Words, he learned, do not extinguish fire. They are fuel. Only silence had saved him, an abrupt, absolute silence that made the tribunal uneasy, that turned accusation into self-doubt. They had released him, not because they believed him innocent, but because his refusal to explain had made them fear the depth of what they did not understand. Since then he had cultivated that silence the way a gardener cultivates night-blooming flowers, pruning, feeding, training it to open only when the moment was perfect. He let the actress sit with her tempest until the sand in the hourglass had dropped another inch. Then he shifted his gaze, not to her but through her, as if she had become transparent, and he could see the future coiled behind her like smoke. She felt the gaze pass through, felt it leave something behind, not comfort exactly, but perspective. When she opened her eyes, the room had not changed, yet everything in it had receded to a manageable distance. For the first time in years, she did not feel the compulsion to fill the air with sound. The silence was terrible, but it was also roomy. She could walk around inside it, breathe. IV. The third veil. The room of power. The diplomat cleared his throat. A small, polite sound, the kind one makes in antechambers while waiting for kings to remember one exists. It was the first overt noise since Niccolò's single sentence, and it carried the unmistakable accent of someone unaccustomed to being ignored. He had been sent here to report back. He was always sent somewhere to report back, but the report he had prepared now felt flimsy as parchment in rain. Niccolò turned toward him, and the diplomat felt the full weight of a gaze that seemed to weigh his soul like a coin to be tested for base metal. Instinctively he began to speak. Something about mutual interests, reciprocal advantages, the usual embroidery that kept nations from choking on their own suspicions. The words emerged polished, professional, empty, and as they emerged, he heard them die in the air like insects against glass. He stopped mid-sentence. The silence that followed was different from the one before. It had texture, depth, the acoustics of a cavern into which he had just shouted his own insignificance. He glanced around the table and saw the others watching him. not with malice but with recognition. Each had, in his or her own way, just experienced a version of the same collapse. The banker, who had intended to present a proposal for recovering his daughter through carefully laundered favors, felt the pages of his memorandum curl in his pocket like dead leaves. The physician felt the diagnosis he had rehearsed, an elaborate theory about the regent's melancholia, shrivel into jargon. The boy poet, who had meant to recite the ode that would make his fortune, discovered that the rhymes tasted like copper pennies in his mouth. One by one they understood. They were not in a room where power resided. They were in a room where power was being redefined, and the first rule of the new definition was that no one could claim it by speaking first. Niccolò let the silence stretch until it became a kind of architecture, vaulting above their heads like a cathedral made of withheld breath. Then he moved, not toward them but around them, circling the table with the unhurried pace of a planet that has no need to justify its orbit. When he passed behind each chair, the occupant felt a subtle pressure between the shoulder blades, as if a hand had been placed there in benediction or warning. None turned to look. Looking, they were beginning to understand, was a form of speech. The air itself had become a language, and the vocabulary consisted of pauses. The fourth veil, the honeyed knife. The widow of the mapmaker broke next, but not with words. She had been turning a small brass astrolabe over and over in her lap, a wedding gift once, now a relic, and the repetitive motion had become a kind of speech she herself had not noticed. Niccolò stopped behind her chair and placed one fingertip on the instrument. The motion ceased. The sudden stillness made her aware of the story she had been telling with her hands. We were happy once, we charted worlds together. Then the world swallowed him. It was a story she had recited to every sympathetic ear for 3 years, and each recitation had made the loss heavier, more ornate, less hers. Now, caught in the net of the room's silence, she felt the story detach itself from her like a skin she had outgrown. The astrolabe became simply metal, cool and inert. She did not cry. The tears, too, seemed suddenly performative. Instead, she felt a spaciousness opening inside her chest, as if the silence had entered and begun redecorating. Across the table, the diplomat, still stinging from his aborted speech, felt the same spaciousness and mistook it for danger. He tried flattery. He had been trained to believe that flattery could unbolt any door. "Master Niccolò," he began, voice as smooth as oiled parchment, "your reputation precedes you like incense before a procession." The words shriveled. Niccolò did not even turn. The diplomat felt the compliment hang in the air like a banner painted on fog. He tried again, this time addressing the company. "Surely such wisdom as we find here tonight deserves a wider stage." The silence answered him. It was not hostile, it was simply impermeable. He felt his own sentences bounce back and strike him in the face. In that ricochet, he glimpsed the truth. Niccolò had set before them all. Flattery is not communication. It is a transaction in which the speaker tries to purchase complicity with counterfeit coin. When the intended recipient refuses the bargain, the coin falls to the ground and reveals its worthlessness. The diplomat's cheeks burned. He had spent years perfecting the art of saying nothing in the most elegant possible way. Now he was confronted with the inverse elegance of saying nothing at all. VA, the fifth veil, the fog of unknown terrain. The physician who had built his reputation on diagnostic certainty found himself adrift. He had come prepared to analyze the regent's moods, to prescribe silence as a therapeutic regimen. He had charts, case studies, Latin tags to armor every assertion. But the silence in this room was not a symptom to be named. It was a condition he had never encountered. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Each time the silence pressed back, dense as water. He felt the boundaries of his expertise dissolve without words. Who was he? The banker beside him had been about to second some point or other, but he too felt the ground shift. Both men realized simultaneously that they had been speaking for years about things they only half understood: politics, finance, the human heart. Their vocabularies had been shields against the terror of uncertainty. Now the shields had fallen away, and the terror stood naked. Niccolò watched them without pity. He had once believed that knowledge conferred safety. He had learned otherwise at the cost of a friend betrayed by a plan too hastily explained. That night, long ago, he had vowed to speak only when the map was complete, the terrain surveyed, the escape routes memorized. He saw the same realization dawning in the physician's eyes. Uncertainty is not the enemy. The pretense of certainty is. The banker's hand stole to his pocket, where the memorandum lay like a confession. Slowly, deliberately, he withdrew it, unfolded it, and let it fall into the candle flame. The paper caught and curled, numbers and clauses blackening into illegibility. No one spoke. The ash drifted down and settled on the velvet like grey snow. Vi Sabiaul, the sixth veil, the whispering gallery. The blind lutenist had been listening with the intensity of a man for whom every sound is a clue to survival. He had followed the creak of the Marchioness's corset, the faint chime of the astrolabe, the flutter of burning paper. Now he leaned forward, sensing the moment when the silence itself became a corridor. "I have carried gossip from court to tavern and back again," he said, voice soft but pitched to carry. "I thought it kept me alive. Useful men are fed. But tonight I hear how the stories I repeated have grown teeth. I told myself they were harmless, like songs. Songs, though, have endings. Gossip only has echoes." He stopped, waiting for the echo of his own admission. None came. Instead, the silence deepened, became a kind of absolution. The lutenist felt the burden of every tale he had ever carried slip from his shoulders. It hit the floor with the sound of nothing at all. Around the table, the others recognized their own complicity in the whispering economy that kept the city sick. The actress had traded rumors for roles, the banker for interest rates, the diplomat for leverage. Now, confronted with the vacuum their words had helped create, they felt the chill of moral vertigo. Niccolò did not lecture them. He simply let the silence indict. In its hush, they heard the rustle of reputations they had shredded without ever seeing the blood. The seventh veil, the mirror of provocation. The boy poet had been silent longest, perhaps because he had least to lose. His copper wages had never bought him influence, only the right to be patronized. But now he felt the silence turn toward him like a searchlight, and with it came the memory of every taunt he had endured. The lisping recitations, the ink-stained fingers, the verses scrawled on tavern walls for drunks to ridicule. A familiar heat rose in his throat. He wanted to speak, to defend the dignity of poetry itself, to prove that words could still build cathedrals in the mind. But the heat collided with the room's stillness and cooled into something harder. He saw that every time he had answered mockery with explanation, he had confirmed the mocker's premise that poetry needed justification. Silence, he realized, was the only answer that could not be co-opted. He folded his hands in his lap and felt the urge to shout subside into a steady, watchful calm. Across the table, the officer recognized the same struggle. He had been baited by cowards who knew exactly which insults would make him draw his saber. Each time he had obliged, he had handed them the power to script his rage. Now, in the absence of response, he felt the script dissolve. The silence offered no lines. It left the provocateurs alone with their own ugliness. The eighth veil, the blueprint in the mind. The sand in the hourglass had dwindled to a thin red thread. Niccolò lifted the glass, held it so the candlelight shone through it like a dying sun. "A plan revealed too early," he said. His second and final sentence is a seed planted in enemy soil. He set the glass down, and did not speak again. Yet the sentence expanded to fill every corner of the room. Each guest felt it touch the secret project they had nursed on the way up the stair. The banker's scheme to ransom his daughter, the physician's plot to poison the regent's melancholy with hope, the diplomat's treaty written in invisible ink. One by one they felt the fragility of those plans, how eloquent exposition would only arm their enemies. The banker's memorandum was already ash. Now the others began to discard their blueprints in subtler ways. The actress let her imagined triumph fade into the velvet darkness. The officer unclenched the fist in which he had been holding the coordinates of a mutiny. The boy poet felt the epic he had meant to declaim dissolve into the purer music of possibility. Silence, they understood, was not the absence of strategy but its most potent form, the strategy that cannot be countered because it has not yet been spoken. The ninth veil. The architecture of unease. The last grains of sand fell. Niccolò did not move. The silence that followed was different again. It had weight and volume. It pressed against the windows. It pooled in the corners like something alive. Each guest felt it settle into the hollows of their bones. They had expected to leave this room with answers. Instead, they carried away questions that would echo for years. The Marchioness would discover that her coronet left behind on the table no longer pained her to remember. The officer would find that his superiors, unnerved by his sudden taciturnity, began to consult him as if he possessed hidden artillery. The banker would learn that his daughter, sensing the change in him, engineered her own escape without any ransom being paid. The physician would become famous for cures that began with the injunction, "Tell me less." The actress would take roles that required no speech at all and would move audiences to tears with the eloquence of a single glance. The diplomat would return home and draft a treaty, so spare it contained only 10 clauses, each of which proved unbreakable. The widow would unroll her maps and find new continents sketched in the margins by her dead husband's hand, continents she would finance expeditions to discover. The boy poet would write verses so silent they were like frost on glass, and those who read them would hear entire symphonies between the lines. The blind lutenist would compose a suite titled The 9 Withdrawals, and when it was played in the regent's palace, the courtiers would excuse themselves one by one, unable to bear the space the music left for their own guilt. Niccolò waited until the candles had burned to stubs, until the first pale suggestion of dawn touched the river beyond the balcony. Then he walked to the door and opened it. No one had noticed it was unlocked. They had assumed themselves prisoners of some occult mechanism. The gesture was itself a lesson. The only bars were those they had carried in their mouths. One by one they filed out, each pausing on the threshold as if to speak, each thinking better of it. The silence followed them down the spiral stair, out into the waking city, into the markets and courts and bedrooms where words were still currency. But they carried inside them now a different coin, weightless and inviolable. When the last footstep had faded, Niccolò returned to the table. The hourglass stood empty. He inverted it once more, though there was no more sand to measure. The gesture was ritual, a promise to himself that the lesson would continue in other rooms, other nights. He stepped onto the balcony. Below, the city stirred, already gossiping about the strange convocation at the citadel of quiet. He listened to the murmur rise, like steam from a kettle, and felt no urge to correct it. Let them wonder, let them invent. What they imagined would be more powerful than any explanation he could give. Far off, a bell began to toll the hour. It was not a bell that had been there the night before. Someone, perhaps the lutenist, perhaps the officer, had commissioned it. They called it the bell of unspoken things, and it rang only once a day, at dawn, its note so deep it was felt in the bones rather than heard. Across the city, men and women paused in their kitchens and counting houses, their tongues stilled by a vibration they could not name. Niccolò listened until the last overtone had soaked into the stones, then turned back inside. The room was empty now, except for the furniture and the ash. He gathered the ash into a small glass vial, stoppered it, and placed it on a shelf beside 8 other vials. Each contained the residue of a previous lesson. He would add no label. The silence itself was memory enough. Years later, travelers would speak of a city where disputes were settled by the length of pauses, where treaties were signed in blank spaces, where the highest office was held by a man or woman who had not spoken for a decade. They would tell of courtiers who carried hourglasses instead of swords, of poets whose blank pages fetched higher prices than illuminated manuscripts, of a palace whose throne was carved from a single block of quiet. If they pressed for names, citizens would shrug and gesture toward the river, where the mist rose each evening like the ghost of all unsaid things. And if the travelers were wise, they would nod and ask no further questions, understanding that some maps are drawn only in the mind, and the surest way to destroy them is to unfold them in public. In the citadel of quiet, the candles had long since guttered out. Moonlight lay across the floor like spilled milk. Niccolò sat in one of the 9 chairs, the plainest, the one no guest had chosen, and listened to the bell of unspoken things fade into the ordinary noises of morning carts and river birds. He felt the silence settle around him like a well-worn cloak. Somewhere in the city, his pupils were moving through their new lives, guardians of a discipline they could never fully explain. Each would fail sometimes, would speak too soon, would forget and remember and forget again. But the silence would remain, patient as stone, ready to receive them when they returned. He closed his eyes and imagined the next gathering, different faces, different griefs, the same table, the same hourglass filled perhaps with black sand this time, or with the dust of broken promises. The lesson would always be the same, though the words would never be spoken aloud. Power belongs to those who master the art of withdrawal. The world clamors to be heard. The wise let the clamor exhaust itself, then step into the hush and claim what remains. A single sentence can build a kingdom or destroy one. But silence is the language of those who rule from the shadows. Master it, and you will not need to shout to be heard. The world will lean in to hear the words you never spoke. Outside, the river kept its own counsel, sliding indivisible toward a sea that had never once explained its tides. Inside, Niccolò sat without moving until the sun climbed the eastern towers and set the astrolabe's empty socket ablaze with reflected light. Then, with a gesture so slight it might have been a breath, he extinguished the remaining candle and let the day take over. The lesson was complete. The silence endured.